The crisp Montana morning air nipped at Jim Walker's weathered face as he stepped out onto his front porch, the wooden boards creaking familiarly beneath his worn boots. The sun was just beginning to peek over the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink that reflected off the morning dew coating his wheat fields. 20 years of working Willow Creek Farm had trained his body to wake before dawn, but this morning felt different somehow. There was an unusual stillness in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Jim's daily routine was as natural to him as breathing. Check the livestock, inspect the fences, and ensure everything was in order before the real work of the day began. The gentle lowing of cattle and soft bleating of sheep usually greeted him as he approached the barn, but today the animals seemed unsettled. His border collie, Max, who normally bounded ahead with enthusiasm, stayed close to Jim's legs, whining softly. Something was wrong. Jim felt it in his bones, the same way he could sense an approaching storm hours before the clouds rolled in. His eyes scanned the paddocks, taking inventory of his animals with practiced efficiency. The cattle were clustered in the corner of their field, and the sheep. "Sarah," he called out, searching for his prized ewe. Sarah had been with them for 6 years, the gentlest and most reliable sheep in their small flock. She was always the first to greet him in the mornings, hoping for an extra handful of feed, but this morning she was nowhere to be seen. Jim's heart rate quickened as he moved through the barn, checking every stall. Max's whining grew more insistent, and the dog kept looking toward the back pasture, where the morning mist still clung to the tall grass. Without hesitation, Jim grabbed his walking stick and headed in that direction, his boots leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. As he walked, something caught his eye, irregular depressions in the grass, as if something heavy had been dragged through it. The pattern was unlike anything he'd seen before, not the typical tracks left by coyotes or other predators that occasionally troubled his livestock. These marks were deliberate, human. The fog began to lift as Jim followed the trail, revealing Sarah's white wool in the distance. She was lying on her side in an unusual position, and for a moment Jim's heart stopped, fearing the worst. But as he got closer, he could see her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She was alive, but something was definitely wrong. "Sarah," Jim called softly, approaching with careful steps. The ewe's head lifted at the sound of his voice, and she let out a weak bleat. As Jim drew closer, he realized she wasn't just lying. There she was protecting something. The morning sun finally broke through the mist completely, illuminating a sight that would forever change Jim's life. Tucked against Sarah's warm body were 4 tiny bundles, wrapped in what looked like old hospital blankets. Jim's hands trembled as he knelt beside his faithful sheep, gently moving aside one of the blankets to reveal a sleeping infant's face. "Dear God in heaven," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle morning breeze. 4 babies, all of them appearing to be newborns, lay nestled against Sarah as if she were their mother. They were surprisingly warm and peaceful, thanks to the ewe's protective instinct and body heat. As Jim carefully checked each infant, his farmer's hands impossibly gentle, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Each baby had a series of numbers tattooed on their tiny arms, the skin still slightly raised and red around the marks, as if they were recently applied. The sight filled him with a mixture of horror and protective fury. Who would do such a thing to innocent children? Jim had seen his share of strange things in his years of farming, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his cell phone and called the one person he knew would know what to do. "Grace," he said when his wife answered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I need you to come to the back pasture and bring blankets, clean ones." He paused, trying to find the words to explain what he'd found. "And Grace, call Dr. Martinez. Tell her we need her out here right away." The next few minutes felt like hours as Jim waited, keeping watch over the mysterious infants. Sarah remained calm, occasionally nuzzling one of the babies when they stirred. The morning sun continued to rise, warming the air and illuminating the strange scene with an almost ethereal quality. The sound of hurried footsteps announced Grace's arrival before Jim could see her through the tall grass. His wife of 25 years appeared, clutching an armful of blankets, her salt and pepper hair escaping from its usual neat bun. The moment she saw the babies, she stopped dead in her tracks, her blue eyes widening in disbelief. "Jim," she whispered, taking in the surreal scene before her. "Are they alive and seemingly healthy?" Jim confirmed, standing to take some of the blankets from her arms. "But Grace, there's something else." He gestured to the numbers on the infant's arms, watching as his wife's expression shifted from shock to horror to determination. Grace had always been the stronger one of the pair, especially when it came to emotional challenges. They'd tried for years to have children of their own, enduring multiple miscarriages before finally accepting that it wasn't meant to be. Now, watching her spring into action, Jim saw the mother she'd always yearned to be. "We need to get them to the house," Grace said firmly, already wrapping one of the babies in a clean blanket. "Dr. Martinez said she'd be here in 20 minutes. Did you check the area? Is there any sign of their mother?" Jim shook his head, carefully lifting another infant. "Nothing yet. Sarah must have found them sometime during the night. If she hadn't—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The morning had been cold enough for frost. Without Sarah's warmth, the babies might not have survived. Working together, they carefully transported the infants to their farmhouse, Sarah following, anxiously behind them as if reluctant to leave her charges. The old farmhouse had never felt more like a sanctuary than it did at that moment, its solid walls promising protection from whatever strange circumstances had led to this morning's discovery. Grace transformed their living room into a makeshift nursery with impressive efficiency, creating safe, warm spaces for each baby using cushions and blankets. As they waited for the doctor, she examined each infant more thoroughly, her nurse's training from years ago coming back instinctively. "They're newborns, Jim," she said quietly, her fingers gentle as she checked their responses. "Can't be more than a day or two old. And look, they're all wearing similar clothing under these blankets. Hospital gear, but no identification bracelets. Someone wanted these babies to survive, but they didn't want them found too quickly." The sound of tires on gravel announced Dr. Martinez's arrival. The local physician had been serving their rural community for over a decade, and if anyone could help them make sense of this situation, it would be her. As Grace went to meet her at the door, Jim found himself standing guard over the infants, a fierce protectiveness already taking root in his heart. Dr. Martinez's examination was thorough but gentle, her dark eyes narrowing at the sight of the tattoos. "In all my years of practice," she murmured, documenting each mark with her phone's camera, "I've never seen anything like this. These babies are healthy, surprisingly so, given the circumstances. But these numbers—" She shook her head. "This isn't random. Someone wanted to make sure these children could be identified." "What do we do?" Grace asked, cradling one of the babies who had started to fuss. "We need to call the authorities, but we also need to be careful." Dr. Martinez finished, her expression grave. "Someone went to great lengths to hide these babies, and those marks suggest something bigger than a simple abandonment case. Let me make some calls. I know people at the state level who can handle this discreetly." As the morning progressed into afternoon, the farmhouse became a hub of quiet activity. The babies needed feeding, changing, and constant attention. Grace seemed to be everywhere at once, her natural maternal instincts in full force. Jim found himself making runs to the nearest town for supplies, his truck loaded with diapers, formula, and other necessities they'd never had reason to own before. The story of how they'd found the infant spilled out of Jim multiple times that day, to Dr. Martinez, to the state investigators who arrived in unmarked cars, to Grace's sister who drove up from Bozeman as soon as she heard. But with each telling, one detail became increasingly clear to Jim. These babies had been placed on his farm for a reason. Whether by chance or design, they'd been entrusted to his and Grace's care, and something deep in his soul told him this was no accident. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and cast long shadows across the farm, Jim and Grace sat on their porch swing, watching the investigators' cars disappear down their long driveway. The babies were finally sleeping inside, monitored by Grace's sister, and for the first time since dawn they had a moment to process the events of the day. "What do you think happened to their mother?" Grace asked softly, her head resting against Jim's shoulder. She must have been so desperate. Jim wrapped an arm around his wife, drawing her closer. I don't know, sweetheart, but I can't shake the feeling that we're meant to be part of this story, whether we want to be or not. Grace's hand found his, squeezing gently. Those marks, Jim. Someone did that to those babies deliberately. Whatever's going on, it's bigger than us. Maybe, Jim agreed, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. But right now those little ones need protection and love, and if there's one thing we've got plenty of on this farm, it's room in our hearts. The sound of a baby's cry drifted through the screen door, and Grace immediately stood, her body responding to the need before her mind could process it. Jim watched her go, marveling at how naturally she'd stepped into this unexpected role. Then he turned his gaze to the back pasture, where Sarah was still pacing near the spot where the babies had been found, as if standing guard against whatever forces had brought them there. Tomorrow, they would begin searching for answers. Tomorrow, they would face whatever consequences came with their decision to open their home and hearts to these mysterious children. But for tonight, Willow Creek Farm had become a sanctuary for 4 tiny souls who needed nothing more than what Jim and Grace had spent their lives preparing to give: unconditional love and unwavering protection. The night settled over the farm, like a protective blanket, stars twinkling above as if keeping watch. In the distance, a coyote called, and Jim felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. Whatever storm was coming, and he was certain one was, they would weather it together, as a family. The next morning dawned with a sense of urgency that contrasted sharply with the peaceful scene inside the farmhouse. Jim woke early as usual, but instead of heading straight to the barn, he found himself checking on each of the sleeping infants. In the soft morning light, the numbers on their arms seemed even more stark and disturbing. Grace was already up, moving quietly through their makeshift nursery with the efficiency of someone who'd been caring for babies all her life, rather than just for the past 24 hours. She looked up as Jim entered, her eyes tired but determined. I think we should start asking around, she whispered, carefully adjusting a blanket around one of the sleeping infants. Someone must have seen something. A strange vehicle, unfamiliar faces. Jim nodded, pulling on his jacket. I'll head over to the miller's place first. Their farm overlooks the road leading to our back pasture. If anyone passed through that way, Tom or Martha might have noticed. But before Jim could reach the door, the sound of tires on gravel caught their attention. Through the window, they saw an unfamiliar pickup truck approaching, raising dust on the long driveway. Jim's hand instinctively moved to the shotgun mounted above the door, though he didn't remove it from its hooks. The truck stopped, and a young woman stumbled out, barely making it 2 steps before collapsing to her knees. Jim and Grace exchanged a quick glance before rushing outside, leaving Grace's sister Ellen to watch over the babies. As they approached the woman, Jim could see she was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair matted against her pale face. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and there was a wild look in her eyes that spoke of desperation and fear. Please, she gasped as they reached her. My babies, I had to keep them safe. Grace immediately knelt beside her, supporting her as she swayed. You're their mother, she asked gently, though the resemblance was already apparent. In the woman's features, the young woman nodded weakly. My name is Emily, she managed before her eyes rolled back and she slumped forward, unconscious. What followed was a blur of activity. Dr. Martinez was called again, arriving in record time to find Emily settled in the Walker's guest room, running a high fever and showing signs of severe exhaustion and dehydration. As the doctor tended to her, Jim and Grace tried to piece together the fragments of information they'd gathered. She knew where to find us, Jim said quietly, standing in the hallway outside the guest room. This wasn't random, Grace. She chose our farm, specifically. Grace's response was interrupted by Dr. Martinez emerging from the room, her expression grave. She's stable but very weak. Whatever she's been through, the doctor shook her head. She keeps mumbling about keeping them safe, about someone coming after them. And those tattoos, I've seen similar marking systems used in research facilities, but never on humans and certainly never on infants. The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Before they could discuss it further, a weak voice called from the bedroom. Emily was awake. Jim and Grace followed Dr. Martinez back into the room, where Emily was struggling to sit up despite the doctor's protests. Her eyes, though fever-bright, were clearer now and filled with an urgent purpose. "I don't have much time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll be looking for us. I chose your farm because I remembered the article about how you tried to adopt years ago, how you fought for those children, even though the system was against you." Grace gasped softly. The article had been published in the local paper over a decade ago, highlighting their failed attempts to adopt after years of fertility struggles. It had been a painful time in their lives, one they'd tried to put behind them. Emily continued, her words coming faster now, as if she feared she might not have another chance to speak them. "I worked at a private research facility, Aegis Genetics. They're doing things there, things that shouldn't be possible. The babies, my babies, they're part of something called Project Legacy. They want to create enhanced humans, starting from birth. But it went wrong. Or right, depending on how you look at it. My babies, they're special, but not in the way Aegis wanted. They're just babies. Perfect, beautiful babies, and I couldn't let them become experiments." Her voice broke, and Dr. Martinez quickly offered her water. After taking a sip, Emily pressed on. "The numbers on their arms, they're not just identification markers, they're part of a tracking system. I disabled the subcutaneous transmitters before I left, but Aegis has other ways of finding them. They'll never stop looking." Jim felt his protective instincts surge. "Why us?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Emily's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Because you have everything they need, isolation, protection, and most importantly, love. I read about you, about this farm, about how you never gave up trying to have a family. I knew you would protect them." Her strength seemed to be fading, but she grabbed Grace's hand with surprising force. "Promise me," she pleaded. "Promise me you'll keep them safe. Don't let Aegis find them. Don't let them become weapons or tools. Let them be children. Let them be loved." Grace's voice was steady as she replied, "We promise. With everything we are, we promise." Emily's relief was visible, her body relaxing against the pillows. "In my truck," she murmured, her eyes growing heavy. "There's a USB drive hidden under the spare tire. Everything you need to know, all the evidence, it's there. But be careful, trust no one outside this room." "I'll get that USB drive," Jim said quietly, moving toward the door. The weight of Emily's words pressed heavily on his shoulders as he stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The truck sat where Emily had left it, a modest blue pickup that had seen better days. As he approached, he noticed subtle details that spoke volumes about her desperate journey. The mud caked on the wheel wells from back roads, the nearly empty gas tank, the careful way she'd parked to enable a quick escape if needed. Using the emergency jack from his own truck, Jim carefully raised the vehicle and removed the spare tire. Sure enough, tucked into a small compartment beneath it was a waterproof case containing a USB drive. His hands trembled slightly as he secured it in his pocket, understanding that this tiny device might hold secrets that could change their lives forever. When he returned to the house, he found Dr. Martinez in the hallway, her expression grave. "Emily's condition is deteriorating rapidly," she said in a low voice. "Whatever she's been through, the stress, the exposure, possibly untreated complications from childbirth, it's taken a severe toll on her body. I've called for an emergency airlift to the hospital in Missoula, but..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jim could read the concern in her eyes. Inside the room, Grace sat beside Emily's bed, holding her hand and speaking softly. The scene struck him with its intimacy. Two mothers, one fighting to protect her children with her last breath, the other preparing to carry on that sacred duty. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "The drive," she whispered. There's more you need to know." Her voice was weaker now, but carried an urgent clarity. The numbers, they're not just identification, they're part of a genetic sequence. Each baby, they're all different, special. The fourth number in each sequence, it's the key. Don't Don't let them find it." Grace leaned closer, squeezing Emily's hand. "We won't. I swear to you we'll protect them with everything we have." A ghost of a smile touched Emily's lips. "I knew you would. When I read about your farm, saw the love in your eyes in that old article, I knew." Her breathing became more labored, but she fought to continue. "There's a contact and on the drive, Dr. Sarah Chen, Berkeley Genetics. She can help, but only if you're absolutely sure it's safe." The sound of helicopter blades thudding in the distance grew steadily louder. Dr. Martinez moved quickly, preparing Emily for transport. But Emily wasn't finished. With what seemed like her last reserves of strength, she gripped Grace's hand once more. "The babies," she gasped. "Their names. I want them to have names. The eldest, the girl with the birthmark like a crescent moon, she's Aurora. The boys, the twins, Thomas and James, and the youngest girl with eyes like starlight, she's Hope." Tears slid down her pale cheeks. "I never even got to hold them properly. Promise me they'll know I loved them." That everything was for them. Grace's own tears fell freely now. "They'll know," she promised. "They'll know every day of their lives how much their mother loved them, how brave she was, how she gave everything to protect them." The helicopter was landing now, its downdraft bending the tall grass in the nearby field. Medical personnel rushed in with a stretcher, their movements efficient and urgent. As they prepared to move Emily, she caught Jim's eye. "The farm," she whispered, barely audible over the commotion. "It's perfect, hidden in plain sight. The electromagnetic interference from the old mining deposits in these hills, it'll help mask their unique biosignatures. That's why I chose here. Keep them close to the land. It'll protect them." As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Emily's eyes closed, her strength finally spent. The medical team moved quickly, rushing her to the waiting helicopter. Jim and Grace stood on their porch watching as it lifted off, carrying Emily toward what they all knew might be her final journey. In the sudden quiet that followed the helicopter's departure, the cry of one of the babies pierced the air. Grace immediately turned to go inside, but Jim caught her arm gently. "Grace," he said softly, pulling the USB drive from his pocket. "Whatever's on this, it's going to change everything. Are we ready for that?" His wife's eyes, though red from crying, held a fierce determination. "Those babies in there, they're ours now. Emily chose us, trusted us. Whatever's on that drive, whatever's coming for them, we'll face it together." She took his hand, squeezing it firmly. "We've spent 20 years building this farm, making it strong, making it safe. Maybe this is why. Maybe everything we've been through was preparing us for this moment." Jim nodded slowly, his free hand reaching up to touch the shotgun mounted by the door, a gesture that had become almost unconscious since the morning's discoveries. "We'll need help," he said. "People we can trust, and we'll need to make some changes around here. Security systems, backup plans, One step at a time," Grace reminded him, her practical nature asserting itself. "Right now we have 4 babies who need feeding, and a whole lot of love to give them. Everything else, we'll figure it out as we go." Inside, Ellen was expertly managing all 4 infants, having arranged them in a careful pattern on the living room floor. She looked up as Jim and Grace entered, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "They're starting to show their personalities already," she said softly. "Aurora's definitely the leader. She won't settle unless she can see all her siblings. The twins seem to communicate without making a sound. And little Hope," she smiled. "Well, she just radiates peace somehow. It's almost supernatural." Grace and Jim exchanged a meaningful look, Emily's words about genetic sequences and special abilities echoing in their minds. But for now, they pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the immediate needs of their newly expanded family. As the sun began to set on one of the most extraordinary days of their lives, Jim stood at the window, watching as Sarah the ewe settled herself in the yard, still maintaining her vigil. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains. But here, in this moment, their little farmhouse felt like the safest place in the world. Grace appeared beside him, little Hope cradled in her arms. "She's right, you know," she said quietly, "about the farm being perfect. It's not just the isolation or the electromagnetic interference. It's the life we've built here. The community we're part of. The way we know every inch of this land, every hiding place, every escape route we never thought we'd need. Jim wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders, gazing down at the sleeping infant in her arms. In Hope's peaceful face, he could see echoes of Emily's determination, and in the faint glow that seemed to emanate from her skin, a glow he was becoming increasingly certain wasn't just his imagination, he could see the extraordinary future they would all face together. Tomorrow, he said, we start making plans. We'll need to convert the old root cellar into a shelter, set up surveillance systems, establish emergency protocols. But tonight, he gently stroked Hope's cheek with one weathered finger. Tonight, we're just a family. A rather unusual one, perhaps, but a family nonetheless. Grace leaned into his embrace, and together they watched as the storm clouds approached, bringing with them the promise of rain and renewal. On the USB drive in Jim's pocket, secrets waited to be unveiled. Secrets that would reshape their understanding of science, ethics, and human potential. But those revelations could wait until morning. For now, in the gathering darkness, Willow Creek Farm had become something more than just a place where crops grew and animals grazed. It had become a fortress of love, a sanctuary for 4 remarkable children and the dedicated parents who would raise them. And somewhere in a hospital miles away, a young mother fought for her life, secure in the knowledge that her children were exactly where they needed to be. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the window pane in a soothing rhythm. Inside, the babies slept peacefully, unaware of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this place, or the remarkable destiny that awaited them. But Jim and Grace knew that their real journey was just beginning. A journey that would test their strength, their love, and their unwavering commitment to protecting the precious lives that had been entrusted to their care. As the storm intensified outside, Jim made his way to his study, the USB drive heavy in his pocket. His ancient desktop computer hummed to life, its familiar startup sound now feeling oddly inadequate for the magnitude of what they might discover. Grace joined him, having ensured all 4 babies were settled with Ellen keeping watch. "Should we wait?" Grace whispered, her hand resting on Jim's shoulder as he inserted the drive. "Maybe we should have someone more. Technical look at this first." Jim shook his head slowly. "Emily trusted us with this. We need to know what we're dealing with." His calloused farmer's fingers moved carefully over the keyboard, opening the drive's contents. What they found made their breath catch. Folders upon folders of classified documents filled the screen. Research protocols, genetic sequencing data, security clearance documents, and most disturbingly videos of what appeared to be experimental procedures. Grace's grip on Jim's shoulder tightened as they opened the first video file. The footage showed a sterile laboratory, where scientists in white hazmat suits moved between rows of specialized incubators. Emily's voice could be heard narrating, "Project Legacy, Day 237. Genetic modifications are showing unprecedented stability in subjects A through D. The quantum consciousness markers are particularly strong in subject D, designated as Hope in my personal notes." Jim quickly closed the video, his hand trembling slightly. "We need to be careful about what we know," he said quietly. "The less we understand about the technical aspects, the better. What we need to focus on is the practical information, how to protect them, what to watch for, who we can trust." And Grace nodded, reaching past him to open a document labeled Security Protocols. As they read through the extensive list of surveillance methods Aegis Genetics employed, their understanding of the task ahead grew more daunting. The company had access to satellite tracking, facial recognition systems, and even deep learning algorithms designed to identify specific genetic markers from a distance. "Look at this," Grace murmured, pointing to a section about the children's unique abilities. "It says their capabilities will begin manifesting around 6 months of age. Aurora's genetic sequence suggests enhanced leadership and strategic thinking. The twins, Thomas and James, have complementary modifications for problem-solving and pattern recognition. And Hope." She paused, her eyes widening. "Hope's modifications are listed as Classification Level Ultra. Whatever she's capable of, it scared them enough to bury it deep. A loud crack of thunder made them both jump, and in the next room one of the babies, Aurora, they guessed from the distinctive cry, began to fuss. The sound brought them back to the immediate present, to the very real and human needs of the 4 tiny lives in their care. "We need help," Jim said firmly, closing the files and removing the USB drive. "Not just with understanding all this, but with protecting them. We can't do this alone." Grace was already reaching for a notepad, her nurse's training kicking in as she began to organize their thoughts. "Dr. Martinez is trustworthy. She's already involved and she has medical connections we might need. Ellen, of course, and I'm thinking about Marcus." Jim nodded slowly. His younger brother had left the military 5 years ago to become a security consultant. He'd always been the family's black sheep, his paranoia about government surveillance seeming excessive, until now. "He's been telling us for years to upgrade the farm's security. Guess he'll finally get his wish." A soft knock at the door interrupted their planning. Ellen stood there, little hope cradled in her arms. "Sorry to interrupt, but I think you need to see this," she said quietly. They followed her back to the makeshift nursery, where Hope lay in her temporary bassinet. In the dim light, they could see what had prompted Ellen's concern. A soft, barely perceptible glow seemed to emanate from the baby's skin, pulsing gently in rhythm with her heartbeat. "It's been getting stronger," Ellen whispered. "And when it does, the other babies, they respond to it somehow. Watch." As if on cue, Aurora's eyes opened, focusing immediately on her youngest sister. The twins stirred in their sleep, turning their heads in perfect synchronization toward Hope. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but inside the room, time seemed to stand still. "It's starting already," Grace breathed. "They're so young, the file said 6 months." Jim moved to the window, scanning the darkness beyond their property. The storm provided good cover, but it also limited visibility. Anyone could be out there, watching, waiting. His mind raced through the immediate changes they'd need to make: security cameras, motion sensors, safe rooms. "First thing tomorrow," he said, turning back to his family. "I'm calling Marcus. We'll need to work fast, but tonight—" He reached down to gently touch each baby's forehead, a blessing and a promise in each touch. "Tonight, we protect them the old-fashioned way. Together." Grace and Ellen arranged sleeping bags on the living room floor, creating a family campout around the babies. Jim made hourly perimeter checks, his shotgun close at hand, while Max patrolled the yard with unusual vigilance. Sarah the ewe remained, at her post outside, joined now by several other farm animals who seemed to sense the importance of their guard duty. As the night deepened and the storm gradually passed, Jim found himself sitting in his rocking chair, watching over his sleeping family. Grace had finally dozed off, one hand resting protectively near Aurora's bassinet. Ellen slept fitfully, stirring at every small sound. The babies, miraculously, slept peacefully, their tiny faces illuminated by Hope's gentle glow. In his pocket, the USB drive felt like a live coal, burning with dangerous knowledge. Tomorrow would bring challenges they could barely imagine. They would need to master new skills, learn to live with constant vigilance, and somehow give these extraordinary children a normal, loving childhood, despite the shadows gathering around them. But for now, in these quiet hours before dawn, Jim allowed himself to feel the pure joy of fatherhood that had eluded him for so many years. These children might carry the weight of revolutionary science in their DNA, but in this moment, they were simply babies, his babies, in need of love, protection, and a place to call home. Outside, the storm clouds began to clear, revealing a sky filled with stars. A new day was coming, bringing with it both danger and hope. On the horizon, the first faint light of dawn began to paint the sky, and with it came the sound of vehicles approaching down the long driveway to Willow Creek Farm. Jim rose silently, moving to the window with practiced stealth. 3 black SUVs were making their way toward the house, their headlights off, moving with purposeful precision. In the nursery, Hope's glow intensified slightly, and all 4 babies stirred in their sleep. The moment they had been preparing. 4 had arrived sooner than expected, but as Jim reached for his shotgun and moved to wake Grace, he felt a strange sense of calm. They had faced impossible odds before: years of failed pregnancies, devastating crop losses, financial hardships. That should have cost them the farm. Each time they had emerged stronger, more determined, more united. This challenge would be no different. They would protect these children with everything they had, not just because they had promised Emily, but because in the span of a single day, these extraordinary infants had become their whole world. Whatever came next, Willow Creek Farm would stand as a fortress of love and protection, its inhabitants bound together by something stronger than blood, the unshakable bonds of chosen family. Jim moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the land and its rhythms. He gently shook Grace awake, pressing a finger to his lips before she could speak. Her eyes widened as she registered the sound of approaching vehicles, but years of partnership had taught them to communicate without words. She immediately began gathering the babies while Jim woke Ellen. "The root cellar," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the stirring infants. "There's a hidden compartment behind the wine racks. I built it during the drought years to store emergency supplies." He pressed the USB drive into Grace's hand. "Take the north path through the orchard. The apple trees will provide cover." Grace's protest was written all over her face, but she knew this wasn't the time for discussion. She and Ellen quickly wrapped the babies in warm blankets, their movements careful and precise. Hope's glow had intensified, casting subtle shadows on the walls, but remarkably, none of the infants were crying. They seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their tiny faces unusually alert in the pre-dawn light. Jim retrieved his shotgun and moved to the window again. The SUVs had stopped about 50 yards from the house, and dark figures were emerging, their movements suggesting military training. In the yard, Max had positioned himself behind the barn, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by a vigilant stillness that Jim had never seen before. A sudden movement caught his eye. Sarah the ewe was creating a distraction, leading several other sheep in an unusual pattern across the front of the property. The approaching figures paused, clearly confused by the animals' behavior. Jim smiled grimly. Even the farm's animals were conspiring to protect their precious charges. "Go," he whispered to Grace and Ellen, who had the babies secured. "I'll hold them off. Buy you some time. Don't stop until you reach the cellar. No matter what you hear." Grace grabbed his arm with her free hand, Aurora cradled in the other. "Jim Walker, don't you dare play the hero. We need you alive." Her voice was fierce despite its softness. "Not playing hero, sweetheart. Playing farmer." He gestured to the cabinet where they kept veterinary supplies. "Got something special planned for our uninvited guests." Understanding dawned in Grace's eyes, and she nodded quickly. Then, with one last look at her husband, she followed Ellen toward the back door, their precious cargo held close. Jim waited until they had slipped into the shadows before moving into action. He worked quickly, gathering supplies from around the house, veterinary sedatives, chemical fertilizer components, and other innocent-looking farm items that could become quite troublesome when properly combined. Years of handling dangerous materials had taught him respect for their power, and now that knowledge would serve a different purpose. The first knock at the door came just as he finished his preparations. Jim took a deep breath, channeling decades of dealing with government agricultural inspectors and bank assessors. He opened the door to find exactly what he expected. Men in tactical gear, trying very hard to look like ordinary government agents. "Mr. Walker?" The man in front spoke with practiced authority. "We're with the Department of Health and Human Services. We have reason to believe you may be harboring individuals of interest in an ongoing investigation." Jim leaned against the doorframe, shotgun held casually but visibly. "Well now, that's quite a mouthful for 5 in the morning. Got some identification there, friend?" The man produced a badge that looked impressively official. Jim made a show of examining it while his other hand remained near the shotgun. "Mighty interesting," he drawled. "Don't recall Health and Human Services having much need for tactical gear and unmarked vehicles. Must be a new department policy." "Sir, we have authorization to search these premises. I suggest you cooperate fully to avoid any complications." Jim's weathered face broke into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I don't doubt you have authorization. Question is, from who?" "See, got an interesting call from the State Attorney General's office just yesterday. Something about being on alert for unauthorized personnel claiming government authority." This was a complete lie, but Jim had learned long ago that the best bluffs were delivered with absolute conviction. He could see uncertainty flicker across some of the younger agents' faces. Their leader, however, remained impassive. "Mr. Walker, we don't have time for games. Where are the children?" "Children?" Jim's expression shifted to genuine confusion. "Well, now, if you'd done your homework, you'd know Grace and I never had any, though not for lack of trying, God knows." He allowed real pain to color his voice, drawing on years of disappointment. The leader's patience was visibly wearing thin. "Sir, we have satellite confirmation of multiple infant heat signatures at this location less than an hour ago. Step aside, or we will be forced to—" His words were cut off by a sudden commotion. From the barn, Max had begun barking frantically, and the sound of distressed livestock filled the air. Several of the agents turned instinctively toward the noise. "Oh, Lord," Jim sighed heavily. "That'd be the coyotes again. Been trying to get at the new lambs. Sure hope those fancy rifles of yours are properly licensed for predator control on private property. Hate to have to file a report about unauthorized weapons being discharged on agricultural land." The leader's hand twitched toward his weapon, but Jim's casual mention of documentation had hit a nerve. These men might have authorization for their mission, but Jim would bet his farm that authorization wouldn't hold up to official scrutiny. "One last time, Mr. Walker, where are the children?" Jim straightened up, letting his folksy manner fall away. "Son, I've worked this land for 30 years, watched the seasons change, buried my parents out by the old oak tree, and survived more droughts and floods than I care to count. My mother used to say every man's got 3 choices when trouble comes calling: run, fold, or stand. Now, way I see it, you boys have about 30 seconds to get back in your fancy trucks and leave the way you came. After that, well," he gestured vaguely toward the barn, "things might get interesting." As if on cue, one of the sheep broke free from the flock, charging directly at the group of agents. In the ensuing chaos, nobody noticed Jim's hand moving to the modified sprinkler control panel he'd installed by the door. The pre-dawn darkness erupted in a chorus of bleating sheep, barking dogs, and shouting men as the farm's irrigation system came to life, except it wasn't water streaming from the nozzles. Jim's special mixture of fertilizer compounds and veterinary sedatives created a fine mist that filled the air, causing immediate disorientation among the agents. Jim quickly shut the door, donning the gas mask he'd kept ready. Through the window, he watched as the tactical team staggered and stumbled, their training useless against this unconventional defense. The sheep, familiar with the farm's unique smells, continued their orchestrated chaos, making it impossible for the agents to regroup effectively. In the distance, Jim heard the distinctive sound of ranch trucks approaching. The neighbors must have seen the SUVs and realized something was wrong. In small farming communities, suspicious vehicles in the pre-dawn hours brought everyone out, armed and ready to help. The leader of the tactical team, fighting against the effects of the sedative, keyed his radio. "Alpha team, fall back. Security." Compromised. Local interference exceeding acceptable parameters. Jim watched as the men retreated to their vehicles, their movements uncoordinated and hasty. The SUVs pulled away just as the first neighbor's truck crested the hill, and Jim allowed himself a small smile. Round 1 had gone to the farmer, but he knew this was just the beginning. Once the vehicles had disappeared and the air had cleared, Jim's neighbors converged on the farm, rifles ready and faces concerned. Tom Miller, his closest neighbor, was the first to reach him. "Jim, everything okay?" Martha saw those vehicles and called everyone. Said they didn't look like any government trucks she'd ever seen. "Just some overzealous federal types," Jim replied carefully. "Got their paperwork mixed up, came to the wrong farm. You know how it is with bureaucrats these days." The neighbors nodded sympathetically, though Jim could see questions in their eyes. They knew him too well to fully believe such a simple explanation, but they also knew him well enough not to press for details he wasn't ready to share. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, Jim thanked his neighbors and assured them everything was under control. Once they had departed, he made his way quickly through the orchard to the root cellar. The morning light filtered through the apple trees, creating dappled shadows that could hide any number of secrets, including, he hoped, the tracks of 2 women carrying 4 babies. The root cellar door was exactly as he'd left it the day before, but Jim knew Grace would have engaged the hidden locks he'd installed years ago. He knocked their old familiar pattern, 3 quick taps too slow, and heard the mechanisms release. Grace's face appeared in the doorway, fierce and beautiful in the morning light. Behind her, Ellen was tending to the babies, who were all remarkably calm despite the chaos they'd just endured. Hope's glow had dimmed to a subtle shimmer, but Jim noticed that Aurora's eyes tracked his movement with unusual intensity for an infant. "They'll be back," Grace said quietly as Jim descended the stairs. "With better preparation and proper authorization next time." Jim nodded, pulling his wife close. "Yes, they will, but we'll be ready." He looked around the cellar, at the wine racks concealing the hidden room, at the stores of food and supplies he'd accumulated over the years, at the 4 extraordinary infants who had transformed their lives in less than 24 hours. "We need to move fast," he continued. "Call Marcus, get him here before sunset. Ellen, can you reach out to Dr. Martinez, see if she's heard anything about Emily?" He pulled out his phone, quickly deleting his call history. "And we need to contact this Dr. Chen from Berkeley. If she's really an ally, we're going to need her expertise." Grace was already in motion, her nurse's training evident in her efficient movements as she checked each baby while simultaneously making plans. "The twins are showing elevated temperature patterns," she reported. "Nothing dangerous, but it's consistent with what the files said about their accelerated development. And Aurora." She paused, watching as the eldest baby tracked a moth's flight path through the cellar with impossible precision. "She's already showing signs of enhanced awareness." Jim ran a hand through his grey hair, his farmer's pragmatism wrestling with the incredible reality they now faced. "One thing at a time. First we secure the farm, then we figure out exactly what these little ones can do and how to protect them from those who want to exploit their abilities." Ellen spoke up from where she was preparing formula. "We should give them normal names too, everyday names to use in public. Even if these men don't come back, others will. The children need to be able to blend in." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Aurora can be Amy, Thomas can be Tim, James can be Jack, and Hope—" She looked down at the youngest baby, whose skin still shimmered faintly. "Hope can be Hannah. Simple names, nothing remarkable." "Nothing remarkable," Jim repeated softly, watching as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the cellar's high windows, creating rainbow patterns on the wall that the babies followed with unusual focus. "Except everything about them is remarkable." He moved to the hidden room, checking the emergency supplies and communications equipment he'd installed during more paranoid times. "We have maybe 48 hours before they regroup and return. By then, we need to have a better plan than chemical sprinklers and angry sheep." Grace's hand found his, squeezing gently. "We protected this farm from drought, from bankruptcy, from corporations trying to force us out. We'll protect it from this too." She looked at the babies, her expression softening. "And we'll protect them, give them the childhood Emily wanted them to have. They may be part of some grand experiment, but they are our children now, and no one messes with a Walker child."